Okay. Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to docket number 240803, the annual non-residential renewable energy solutions program review for year 4. My name is Chairman Marissa July. I'm joined virtually today by my colleagues, the Vice Chairman Jack Pekoski and Commissioner Michael Karen. We are here this morning for a technical meeting in this matter. There is an agenda that has been published to the docket. In just a moment, we'll turn to a joint presentation from the electric distribution companies. To begin with this morning, just a few housekeeping matters in case this is your first time participating with us. We do have a court reporter present, so please refrain from using the chat function of Zoom. We ask that any comments are verbalized for purposes of the record. And in addition, you can please make sure that you are clearly identifiable by name and affiliation the first time that you speak for clarity of the record. After the presentation today, we will go through questions. We'll turn first to authority staff questions. If there is time, we will allot for questions from other stakeholders. If we get to questions from other stakeholders, I'd ask that you locate the raise hand function under the reactions tab at the bottom of the screen. That is how we will process questions from other stakeholders. So without further ado, we're going to turn first to the Eversource Energy and United Illuminating Company teams for presentation. The first person listed on my agenda is Mr. Rice. And we have a couple of team members presenting. We are having a little bit of technical difficulties on our side with the presentation this morning. I know we normally offer to present this screen, but if someone from the presentation team could share your screen to run the slides, I think that would be appreciated from our end today. Mr. Rice, since you were listed first on my agenda, I'm going to turn to you and wish you good morning.
Good morning, Chair and Commissioners. So I'm going to promptly turn it over to our presenters who are doing the bulk of the talking this morning, which is Aaron Dubuskus, Manager of Commercial Solar Programs for Eversource, and then I believe it's John King for UI. Aaron and John, is one of you able to pull up the presentation, or do we want to have someone else on the team do that?
Yeah, if somebody else on our team could do it, that would be great.
I don't know if Julie Castillo or Brian Topper, if you can pull up the presentation, and then if they can be given the ability to share their screen, I think we can get started.
Absolutely, it should be enabled, and I apologize for that.
They might just need a minute to get their screens ready.
Very good.
This is the core reporter. As we're waiting, would you spell those last two names for me, please? Julie Castillo.
Yeah, Castillo, Castillo, and then
Brian
Topper, Topper.
Thank you.
So apologies. I think so Brian Topper says he's unable to share. Can we just confirm that he has permissions?
It says that it's been enabled. Um,
There we go. Okay. Seems like we're all set. So good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to present today. My name is Aaron Dabauskas, Manager of Operations for Renewable Programs at Eversource. I'm joined by my director, Brian Rice, as well as Christy Prescott and John King from United Illuminating. Next slide, please. Just making sure that's working. Yep. Okay. So we do have some brief discussion topics for today. Both companies will go over their yearly program results with some different looks at the yearly data. We'll talk a little bit about the legislative change that impacts the NRES program as a result of Connecticut Public Act 24-31. And lastly, we'll discuss price cap setting within the NRES program. And next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we'll get into yearly program results now. Next slide, please, Brian. So here's a look at the number of overall bids and capacity received for Eversource in years 1 through 3 of the NRES program. So I think the general message to take from the data is that interest has remained strong and stable for all 3 years of the program, with year 1 being a bit of an outlier, as we have had about half the capacity, or as we did have about half the capacity of years 2 and year 3. But as you can see in year 2 in the left bar chart in the green color, we received 564 bids for the February and August RFPs combined, and about half that so far in this year's February offering. So we're trending on about that same level as we did in year 2. And the same does go for the overall capacity received, the green color on the right, a little over 200 megawatts received for year 2, with about half that received so far in the year 3 February RFP, with the August RFP remaining. Next slide, please. So here's a look at capacities received against what we had available for each program size category. The available capacities are only the approved baseline capacities and don't include any reallocations. So you can see on the left, the small category, we've been heavily oversubscribed in all 3 years. In year 1, we had 10 megawatts to award and received 20. Year 2, we had 20 megawatts to award and received more than double that at 50 megawatts. And we're trending on that same path for year 3 with 14.4 megawatts to award and almost double that received already in the February offering. So it's the same general story for the medium zero category, where we have been heavily oversubscribed for each year of the program so far. Next slide, please. So here's the same exercise, but showing the large, zero, and low emission categories. We have been heavily oversubscribed in the large category in all 3 years. In years 1 and 2, we received more than double the available capacity and close to double so far in year 3 February. The low emission category has also been oversubscribed, but not to the degree of the other zero emission categories. Although in the year 3 February RFP, we were the most oversubscribed in low emission that we have been in any program year. Next slide, please. So now we're going to shift gears a little bit and show the breakdown of bid preferences in each program category. So we'll start with the medium category. So blue does represent the number of bids selected, while red is indicative of selected bids with the distressed municipality bid preference, and orange is brownfield and landfill. And green is the representative color for carports, but to date there have been none selected in the medium zero category. So the data does show an uptick of in the percentage of selected bids with the distressed municipality bid preference from 25% in year 1 to 58% in year 2 and up to 69% in year 3 February RFP. Not too much to take from the brownfield and landfill data. Those selected bids have been minimal in all years. And once again, just to reiterate, there have been no carport bids selected in the medium category. Next slide, please. So here's the large zero emission category bid preference breakdown. Same general trend as the medium category with respect to the percentage of distressed municipality projects. 60% in year 1 of selected bids were distressed municipality, up to 82% in year 2. all the way up to 100% of the 5 selected bids so far in the year 3 February RFP have had the distressed municipality bid preference. And again, same as medium, minimal brownfield and landfill selected projects. And once again, no carport or canopy projects have been selected in the large category. Next slide, please. So the low emission category also shows the same general trend, but the volume of projects is significantly lower, as low emission does have the smallest carve out capacity wise out of all the categories. I think the highlights here are, again, similar to the other categories we've already reviewed. The distressed municipality preference is increasing in percentage, with 100% of the 3 bids selected in the year 3 February RFP having the distressed municipality preference. And like the other 2 competitive categories, the low emission category has not seen any carport or canopy bids executed in the first 2.5 years of the program. Next slide, please. So this chart shows percentage breakdown of selected bids in the program years and bid preference breakdown, rather. It's largely the same data we already reviewed on the other charts, but just summed up all in one place. And I think, again, the overall message is that distressed municipality projects are becoming more prevalent, while the other bid preference categories don't really show too much of a pattern, with the exception of carport canopies not being selected in any of the competitive categories. Just one additional note, though, on carport projects, we do have 5 active agreements in the small category for carports, but since the small category is not impacted by bid preferences, we didn't show that in any of the charts. Next slide, please. So now we're going to move into Eversource's yearly tariff type breakdown. So that's buy all and netting. You can see the first slide that we're showing here is the breakdown of netting and buy all bids that were submitted, not selected. We'll show selected on the next slide. The breakdown in the pie charts, netting bids are represented as the blue slice, while buy all bids are represented by the orange slice. And the small bar charts on either side of the pie chart show the breakdown of buy all and netting in each size category, with buy all being on the left and netting on the right. And generally, buy all projects are more numerous in nature in the larger size categories, while netting projects are generally more prevalent in nature in the smaller size tiers, and mainly the small zero emission category. Next slide, please. So here's the same visual as the last slide, but this time for executed bids. Again, buy all projects are generally more prevalent in the larger tiers, with netting bids dominating a small category. And executed bids do carry the same general breakdown of buy all versus netting as seen with submitted bids, about 60-40, sometimes closer to 50-50, but that trend has held fairly stable across all 3 years and across submitted and execution. And just a final note on buy all and netting is that Eversource hasn't executed any netting bids in any competitive category in the year 3 February RFP. The only netting bids that we've executed so far in the year 3 February RFP have been in the small category. So just to reiterate, the medium, large, and low categories, the only executed contracts so far in the year 3 February RFP were buy all in nature. Next slide, please. And our last slide on Eversource's yearly results is a breakdown of pricing for each competitive category in all 3 program years. You can see medium, large, and low emission. The slide shows the highest selected price in dark green, the lowest selected price in blue, and the weighted average selected price in light green. So in all 3 competitive categories, the highest selected prices have gone down, which is likely a function of decreasing price caps and competition. And lastly, weighted average prices have gone down year over year in the medium and large zero categories, with the low emission category being a little bit tougher to analyze just due to the lower volume of bids. Trends can more easily fluctuate in the low category. But we did see the weighted average pricing of the low emission category go down from year 2 to year 3 February. So I'm going to turn the presentation over to John King, who's going to get into United Illuminating's yearly program results.
Good morning, everyone. John King here from United Illuminating. First slide here, we are showing the years 1 through 3 February NRES results for bids received. As you can see, similarly to Eversource, the small zero emission category has been our most popular, then followed by the medium zero emission category, And over the past 3 years, we've seen a low participation rate in our large and low emission size categories. Next slide. Here you see again, this is in terms of megawatts received. Small zero emission category and medium zero emission category are again our most popular. In all program years, the small zero emission category has received 31.49 megawatts. The medium zero emission category has received 25.7 megawatts over all years, 8.84 for large and 6.49 for low emission. Next slide. Here's a breakdown of the capacity of megawatts received versus available megawatts. Here again, you can see that our small zero emission category has been oversubscribed, and our medium zero emission category was oversubscribed in the year 2 program year. Next slide. Continuing over to the large zero emission category and low emission category, you will see that in all program years, the large zero emission category has been undersubscribed. In the low emission category, the year 3 February procurement was the only solicitation where megawatts received was greater than the allocated capacity. Next slide. Shown here is a representation of our average prices by size category, noting that the small zero emission projects are price takers. However, we represented them here just to make sure we're encompassing all project size categories. And as you can see, there is relatively no trend between the year 2 and the year 3 Feb. We've seen an increase from medium year 2 to year 3, and then there's a decrease from year 1 to year 2 in large, and a decrease from year 1 to year 3 February. There was no bids received in the year 3 February procurement for the large zero emission category, and there was no bids received for the low emission category in the year 2 procurement. Moving on to tariff type breakdown for year 1. In year 1, we saw 52% of bids submitted were under the netting tariff and 47% for the buy-all tariff. On the chart to your right, you will see how they're broken down by size category. As you can see, in year 1, the netting tariff was more popular for the small zero emission category. And then as well for the medium category, there was more popularity for buy-all and large, and netting for low emission in year 1. Next slide. On to year 2, we saw a switch in which tariff type was more popular. The buy-all tariff accounted for 60% of the bids submitted, and the netting tariff accounted for about 40% of the bids. In year 2 program, we saw a majority of the bids being submitted under the buy-all tariff. They were small zero emission category and also the medium zero emission category. Next slide. Moving on to year 3 February, again, out of bids received, the buy-all category was much more popular with 67% of the bids received versus 32% for the netting tariff. Next slide. Shown here is a breakdown of the tariff types over all RFP years 1 through 3 February. Apologies on the bottom right hand of the slide. The number of bids submitted under the netting tariff is incorrect. The correct numbers are 101 small, 19 medium, 1 large, and 3 low emissions. The charts, however, are represented correctly. Again, as you can see here, the buy-all tariff has been most popular among bids received. Moving on to bid preferences, the distressed municipality bid preference has taken a large popularity in the year 1 program as well as the others. In year 1, we had received 9 bids under the distressed municipality with 1 bid under the brownfield bid preference. Following year 1 and year 2, again, the distressed municipality was favored with 13% bids received that claimed the distressed municipality bid preference. 6 received the solar carport canopy bid preference. Lastly, in year 3 February, this past procurement, 4 bids received claimed the distressed municipality bid preference. One bid claimed the landfill and one bid claimed the solar carport canopy. I will now pass back to Aaron to discuss the legislative changes.
Thanks, John.
Mr. Dubakis, let me, I apologize for interrupting, but it might be best if we stop here and have any questions from my staff on the results to date, and then pick up with the legislative change, if that's okay.
Sure. Yep.
So let me just pause and see if Ms. Charles has any questions on the slides presented so far.
Yeah, thank you for that presentation. I just have a few clarifying questions. So my first one is in reference to slide 13 for Eversource and slide 18 for UI. So I was just wondering if the companies could confirm whether the selected bid prices shown in those slides include or exclude the bid preferences.
They don't. They're not. They're actual selected bid prices. So they're not evaluated bid prices. They're the contracted prices, at least for Eversource.
That is the same for United Illuminating.
Okay, thank you. And then a question on slide 18. Could UI provide any insight into why the average bid price for the medium category increased from year 2 to this year's February solicitation?
I think it would go in line with the fact that we were oversubscribed in the medium zero emission category this February procurement. So all bid prices that we received were essentially selected.
Thank you. And do you have any context into why there might have been fewer submissions this year?
I do not.
Okay, thank you. And then just one last question. This is on slide 6 and 7 for Eversource regarding the bid preferences. So I understand that no solar canopy or carport bids were selected in the solicitation. I was just wondering if any were submitted.
Yeah, we can check that. We did have some submitted. So in year 1, there was no carport preference. In year 2, we had 4 medium bids submitted with the carport preference, and no other categories submitted anything. And let's see, in year 3, February, we had 1 low emission bid submit with a carport, and that's the extent of the submissions.
Okay, I appreciate that. That is all my questions on these slides. Thank you.
Thank you. And Mr. Arpin, do you have any questions on the slide so far?
I do. Thank you, Madam Chair, and I think the EDCs for their presentation so far. So I was wondering if you could please turn to slide 10. So my first question, considering the number of NRES projects that received the distressed municipality bid preference last year, do the EDCs recommend any changes to the requirements or value of the distressed municipality bid preference? Why or why not?
So I don't think we're in a position to recommend anything specific. What we've always maintained, at least, and we've submitted this in our written comments in the past, is that the only verifiable and guaranteed method to guarantee that a distressed municipality does receive any benefit from a renewable project would be, 1, to locate the project in a distressed municipality, as it would add, something like tax base, or 2, to require a minimum level of allocation to beneficial accounts. Beyond that, the EDCs don't really have any visibility into what's happening behind the scenes. So I think if there were any change to be made, it would be either requiring them to be located in a distressed municipality, which is one of the ways that you can obtain the bid preference so far in the program, or to require a minimum allocation percentage to the beneficial accounts that were used to size the program. As far as a level of what the minimum allocation should be, I don't think that's been analyzed or discussed yet, but those are the 2 items that we would consider to be verifiable.
Okay,
Well, so-
thank you for that. Does UI have any additions to that?
And I think Brian Rice from Eversource had something to add if I heard his voice.
Yeah, just while UI's thinking of what they want to add, the only point I want to clarify is to remind Pura staff that the eligibility criteria for the distressed municipality bid preference has changed over the 3 years that we're looking at. In year one, I believe it was limited only to projects located in a distressed municipality, and then it was subsequently changed to also include projects that allocated to accounts in distressed municipalities. So as the eligibility criteria was expanded, so too was the level of participation or level of selection of distressed municipality projects.
Thank you for that. Does UI have anything that they would like to add?
Morning. Yep, go ahead, John.
I was just going to say I defer to anything you have to say.
Thanks. I'm Christy Prescott from United Illuminating. I was going to actually add what Mr. Rice had added, that we did see a sizable increase in the number of applications seeking that bid preference for distressed municipalities upon the definitional change and the inclusion of projects that are located, allocations that are located to distressed municipalities. And we continue to see that that's an exercised bid preference, and I think that the bid preference process works well to try to solicit project applications and provide those projects an opportunity to be selected with an evaluated bid price that is different than their overall selected bid price.
Thank you for that response. So Eversource had suggested potentially having a minimum allocation of beneficial accounts, the size projects receiving the distressed municipality bid preference. Have the EDCs considered a specific number for that, or are they still kind of thinking about that?
Yeah, we haven't. That's just one of the verifiable methods. I wouldn't claim to be an expert on what a benefit would be to a distressed municipality, but from our perspective and invisibility to what it actually amounts to a benefit, that would be what as an EDC and a program administrator that we could verify is actually occurring.
Yeah. And then if you look to other examples, 20% has been a benchmark in other programs. That's the threshold, for example, for multifamily affordable housing projects that are eligible for the RRES program. But certainly other stakeholder input on any changes to the bid preference and minimum allocations would be welcome.
Thank you for that. So staying on this slide, my next question here, can the EDCs provide any context or reasoning behind the decrease in the number of projects utilizing the brownfield and landfill bid preference from year 2 to year 3 of the NRES program?
I don't think we have any direct context, other than maybe to assume that the brownfield and landfill sites are finite in nature, and that the low-hanging fruit, so to speak, would probably have used first. But as far as specifics, that would be something that you would have to ask the developing community. But my guess is that the low-hanging fruit, so to speak, has been kind of picked off the tree to start with the program.
Thank you for that. Does UI have any additional information that they would like to add?
And similar to Mr. Vasquez, the EDCs don't have the kind of the decision making by the developers. I would suggest that's a very valid question for the developers, maybe even those that are on the call today. I'd venture to guess, however, that the liabilities associated with project work located in brownfields and landfills may be more complex, and maybe issues around site control and construction on those locations where there are already identifiable environmental issues may pose some level of barrier potentially over a distressed municipality where you wouldn't be dealing with those issues.
Thank you for that response. So my next question here, again, staying on this slide. So in the year 3 NRES decision, the authority approved several changes to incentivize solar carport project enrollment, including increasing the solar carport bid preference to 30%. Can the EDCs provide any insights into why there continues to be limited enrollment of solar carport projects in the NRES program this year?
I personally would not be able to provide insight onto that. I think that's a developing community question. Their financial analysis that goes into each project and whether or not it's financially feasible for them to build a carport project. It may have something to do with what Christy just mentioned, and that other bid preferences, such as the distressed municipality preference, are easier to obtain. But as far as why projects are not actually being built, I think that's more of a developing community question.
Does UI agree with that statement?
I do. I don't have any direct knowledge. I will say that, in United Illuminating space, we probably do have, perhaps in our smaller footprint, maybe some more locations where we have kind of carports and canopy locations that are already pre-existing that may be able to be utilized. So I have been surprised that we haven't received kind of bids that we have selected in that category, but I don't have the intel. And again, I would recommend that question go to developers.
Thank you for that response. Now, could the EDCs please turn to slide 12? So my next question, why are all of Eversource's executed netting projects in the small zero emission category?
Again, that's not a question that we can really respond to. That would have to be that would have to be a question for the developing community and how they analyze projects and what they see as most beneficial to them and their customers from a financial and pricing perspective.
Does UI agree with that? I believe UI had a similar breakdown of netting and buy all.
Our split was a little more different. We had 139 small, 101 small for net, or 139 for buy all and 101 for small zero emission. So I think it's a little bit of a different split. And again, we defer to the developed community as to why.
I could add maybe a little bit more context. In the small category, so energy prices have a big impact on where bids are evaluated. So in the competitive categories, energy prices play a large role in where projects are located in a bid queue. Whereas in the small category, it's essentially first come, first serve with the 2-week window selection process. And energy prices, you're price taking, you're not price making in the small category. So that may be one of the driving reasons. But as far as, the actual reasons as to why developers don't seek more netting bids in the competitive categories, that would be something that you would have to ask them. But I would imagine that the retail value of energy and its impact on bid prices does matter to how many netting bids against buy all bids are selected.
I mean, I will add that what we see is very different commercial approaches between netting and buy all. I think you have to bear in mind if somebody's taking a netting approach, the expectation is there's an existing load, there are existing charges that customer is incurring that a behind the meter system can offset. What we see more frequently with the buy all projects is, of course, they're separately metered. But I think even amongst the buy all projects, the majority of them are directing all credit to a third party tariff payment beneficiary. So that the buy all ends up being much more of I'll call it a cash driven commercial model where it's producing cash flows for either the customer or third party beneficiary as opposed to bill credits that can really only be monetized by offsetting utility charges.
And one more thought to add on that question. With the addition of the rooftop buy all bid, or not bid preference, but project type within the program, not having to verify size to load, I think that might be an easier path for developers to submit projects into rather than having to verify size to load in the netting categories or for the netting tariff. That could be another driving factor there.
I appreciate that response. So now I'd like the EDCs to please turn to slide 13. So do the EDCs have any data indicating that NRES solar prices incurred by the customer or developer have declined for year 3 compared to prior program years? And it's okay if the EDCs don't, and if it's better directed toward developers.
I think that's, I think that would be better directed toward the developing community.
Okay, thank you for that response. And my final question here, could the EDCs please turn to slide 15? Can UI explain the lack of bid submissions in the large zero emission category in the year 3 February procurement?
I think one of the things that might be correlation to this is that the UI service territory footprint may not exactly have the best footprint to host a large zero emission project.
So then, in compared to prior years, would UI say that there's just fewer sites now that the program is in its 3rd year?
I'll defer to Ms. Prescott on that one.
Thank you. I can't quite guarantee that is the case, but again, in the UI service territory, I think some of the land prices themselves, even if they're not maybe prohibitive when a developer is looking at the cost to develop to obtain that lease or locations, and so. And there's only so many available locations in our service territory for projects of that size. And so therefore, that's why you'll see that in our prior years of allocation of megawatts, why we don't end up having the same allocation methodology of the same megawatts for each category between the EDCs for just that reason. We're trying to adjust for the projects that we see coming in and adjust for our observation that where we're oversubscribed in the smaller or the medium versus the large. And so we've been trying to direct our procurements to the areas of interest.
Thank you for that. And those are all my questions relating to this slide so far. So I turn it back to you, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think we can go ahead and move on to the legislative presentation. And I thank you all for letting us interact with those questions so far.
Thank you. So the last couple of items we wanted to briefly touch on are legislative changes in price caps within the NRES program. So passed in May of this year, Public Act 24-31 did establish new legislation that is applicable to the NRES program. And so starting in 2025 with the year 4 NRES procurement, the new legislation does open up the possibility for statutory capacity allotments to be exceeded in a given procurement year, with the general idea being to analyze the aggregate tariff compensation of all selected projects in the current year against aggregate tariff compensation of all selected projects in the previous procurement year. And if the aggregate value of the previous year exceeds the current year, additional projects may be selected in the current year, which would ultimately result in the exceeding of the standard capacity allocation. While no methodology has been established for this process, the EDCs do believe that any additional capacity that's opened up should be allocated to the small zero category for a few reasons. The first being the small category has a very high interest level and has been consistently oversubscribed. Another reason being pricing in the small category is fixed, so additional capacity allotted to that category has no impact on competitive pricing. And lastly, in general, small projects are most readily able to interconnect given the current grid constraints in the state of Connecticut. And the EDCs would also recommend maintaining that same 80-20 split that the program employs for any newly available capacity, and that's to keep costs and benefits equitable amongst the two service territories. Next slide, please. So just a quick slide on price cap setting methodology within the NRES program, and this is largely a reiteration of our written comments filed back in June, but the basic message that we'd like to get out there is to keep price cap setting methodology the same year over year, or at least as much as possible. And we believe that maintaining consistent methodology does allow for stakeholders and participants to be confident in a year over year understanding of the price setting mechanisms that are used in the program, which in turn should allow for easier financial planning for future projects. And if there is a belief that the current methodology does too largely impact netting rec caps as a result of high retail energy values, there can be adjustments made to the net present value rates and calculation, or we could simply revert back to previous year's energy pricing if that was deemed appropriate. The next slide, please. And that is all we have today. We have provided our respective EDC program websites and NRES program emails for reference on the slide. I, again, thank you for the opportunity to present today.
Thank you. Let's go back to the staff questions first on the legislative changes and then the price cap setting. Ms. Charles, did you have questions on legislative?
Yeah, I just have a couple questions on the legislative changes, if you wouldn't mind pulling that slide up again. I can just go ahead and ask while we're getting the slides back up. So for the selection process that the EDCs envisioned, where any excess would be allocated to the small category, I was just wondering if the EDCs could elaborate on whether those additional projects would continue to be randomly selected, or if there should be any kind of preference given to certain types of projects.
I don't think that's something we've considered, but if Brian Rice has a comment, it sounded like he was.
Yeah, I mean, absent direction otherwise, and rule changes, I think our expectation would be we would follow the current selection process. So we've now reinstituted with the 2-week window model. So projects would be randomly queued based on their submission in that initial period, and then after that would be on a first come first serve basis. So we would establish a queue. And right now, what happens is that the majority of that queue isn't selected because we hit the cap quickly. And so what we propose is that we'd maintain that queue, and then as we kind of conclude selection and contracting for the remaining categories, if there's additional capacity available, we would come back to the queue and make awards to more small projects. But certainly, if there was a desire to institute more preferences, there could be policy reasons to do that. That could be implemented.
I appreciate that. Did I have any additional information to add there?
No, nothing markedly different. I'll just say that I know projects, go through a pretty intense, preparation of their applications. They submit those applications, and then, especially in the small category where there's a random selection. I think if you were to keep going back to the queue, that's one way to do it, and it's essentially fair because we've done the one random selection. Projects see their place in the queue, and then they can know what to expect, and they can either move on or think about going to applying for the next year. There's another school of thought that says it would be another chance at for those projects that weren't selected to be reallocated. But there are always pros and cons to that. Someone who's next in line who would get that next project would maybe not be selected. So it is it's a difficult process when you are running a competitive procurement with a limited number of capacities. So I guess I'm just reiterating what Mr. Rice said is we can do it. However, the authority chooses to have us do it. We understand there are pros and cons even with a random selection, but the authority has, had us put that back in place. So again, we administer at the as we're informed by the authority, and we don't have the real kind of history, except for the fact that absent a 2-week window or random selection, what has happened is, it's a very oversubscribed situation in the first hour or two, that projects, that may have more staff or more ability to submit more applications may fill up that queue faster.
Thanks for that response. And then my other question was around implementing these legislative changes. So selecting additional projects up to an aggregate compensation cap. Would doing that by the year 4 procurement require any changes to the EDC's application processes or any other EDC systems in the procurement?
Off the top of my head, I don't believe so. We would have the submitted bids as per usual, and we would just have to do an analysis of year-over-year aggregate compensation. I don't believe there's any modification necessary.
Thank you. And is that the same for UI?
Correct. I don't think we see any challenge associated with that besides just the administrative issues of time.
Okay, I appreciate that. And that's all my questions on these slides. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Arpin.
Yes, I just have a couple of questions, and I'd like to thank the EDCs again for their presentation on this topic. So staying on this slide, I was wondering how the EDCs would define aggregate tariff compensation for all selected projects if Pure decided to allow additional megawatts beyond the program's cap.
I'm going to defer to Brian Rice on this question.
Yeah, I mean, I think we'd welcome the opportunity to submit kind of a formal methodology in writing. But just to talk it out, I think the approach would effectively be looking at the pool of selected projects and determining what their lifetime compensation would be based on estimated generation and their bid price. So effectively getting a total financial commitment based on those values, comparing that to prior years. And then if you identify a difference in dollars that's favorable and would permit the selection of more capacity, then taking that dollar amount and dividing it by the expected lifetime compensation for a small project by megawatt. And then you would effectively have the number of megawatts of additional capacity that could be awarded in the small category. So again, that's kind of that's probably the most logical way we've thought about it in the discussions we've had. But I think we would welcome the opportunity to submit a formal methodology on paper in the proceeding, and then other stakeholders, of course, may have other ideas as well.
Does UI have any additions that they would like to add to that?
Frankly, I was looking forward to this discussion because, again, we are very interested in the authority's position on what those words mean and what do you believe is the right approach to take here, as well as the development community. For us, we can provide the statistics and the facts of what have occurred in prior years. But kind of really understanding recommendations from the development community who are operating in other jurisdictions and things may be valuable to this exercise.
I appreciate that response. So my next question here, moving on from that topic, can the EDCs further elaborate on why any excess capacity should be allocated first to the small zero emissions category instead of to the lower priced or more competitive project categories?
Sure, I can take that first. The EDCs, or at least Eversource being in the position of administering this program, have frankly been in a lot of challenging discussions with customers that are closed out of the NRES program that want to do small projects. Like just anecdotally, there's a food bank in Eversource territory that has sought to participate with a small project for over several solicitations that has been unable to do so. And there are many other examples of that. So it's really frustrating to have small businesses, institutions that want to install the types of projects that serve on-site load, that supply their own energy, and are effectively viewing the program as a lottery. That a lottery with that there are more losers than winners. So a lot of interested projects are being turned away, and that's not really a good experience to promote continued development of solar in Connecticut. And then the other reasons, the we are kind of a little bit leery on how the possibility that capacity could be added to the large category might impact competitive decisions and decisions about bid pricing. We can't say aiming, but we also can't rule it out. So when you add capacity to the small category that are price takers, you know, you're not really, you eliminate that risk of adverse impacts to competition. And then we also don't want to discount the ability to interconnect. We're very concerned that a lot of the projects being submitted in the large category and even the medium category, again, they can submit a fixed price bid without ever planning to interconnect, without having any knowledge of their ability to interconnect, the cost to interconnect. And we're really concerned that a lot of these projects are going to struggle to move forward. So ultimately, we're tying up program capacity in projects that aren't getting built, that aren't moving forward and aren't actually adding to the base of clean energy generation in Connecticut. There's much less concerns with small projects. A project less than 200 kW that's sited to serve load is going to have a much more higher likelihood of being able to be completed on a timely schedule, interconnect, and add to the actual installed base of clean energy.
Thank you for that response. Does UI have anything that they wanted to add?
No, we'll just say that we have the same situations where we have, you know, small projects who have submitted year over year that have not been selected. So those are challenging discussions for us. And, you know, we understand the balance. Certainly, the reason we like a competitive procurement is we continue to like to see the costs going down. Think about the way we're setting the cap for smalls. Effectively, if the price goes down for the other projects, then the smalls will continue to go down. So we recognize the smalls are a bit higher in price, but you know, the demand is greater for those, as you can see on our other slides. So we felt that was a fine balance for the excess or for the additional megawatts that may be determined.
Thank you for that. So I just wanted to follow up on a point that Eversource raised a moment ago about allocating excess capacity to large, potentially impacting bid prices for those categories. I was wondering if Eversource or UI could elaborate on that possibility a little more.
Yeah, I'll elaborate, and I'll start by saying it's tough to. Yeah, I don't have a crystal ball, so I don't know what could happen or how you know, any profit maximizing entity would choose to structure bids. But I mean, we can't rule out that, you know, in some scenario, some entity might price bids in such a way that, you know, they try to, you know, take advantage of the fact that capacity could be expanded and we could select progressively higher cost bids. Again, I really can't say anything more than that, except that we haven't thought through how you would structure kind of a method for increasing capacity that would, you know, try to address any competitive elements. I mean, we might be overly concerned, frankly. It might really not be anything there. But when you look to the small category, then there definitely isn't any kind of competitive concerns there, because everybody's getting the same price no matter what.
Thank you for that. I believe those are all of my questions. Again, I want to thank the EDCs for their time today, and I turn it back to you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. So I think what I'd like to do is open it up to stakeholders for any questions on the EDC's presentation. And then after we have any questions from stakeholders, I'd like to circle back to some of the questions that PURA staff posed that are more appropriate for developers and see if we can get any responses on those. But for now, I'll invite any stakeholders that have questions on the presentation that we received this morning. again, you can enter the queue using the raised hand function under the reactions tab at the bottom of the screen. So pause and see if there are any questions on what we've heard so far today. Okay, if there are no questions, I think we can take the slides down and thank the teams from both Eversource and UI for your presentation and for answering our questions this morning.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Mr. Arpin, if you can come back up, I think we had a couple of questions that may be more appropriately directed to any developers. So maybe if we can take this one at a time, I'll ask Mr. Arpin to repeat one of the questions at a time. And if you're a developer on the phone and have any initial reaction to some of these questions, we would really love any input that you have. So Mr. Arpin, do you want to restate one of those?
Yeah, so I can start with the first one that I previously asked the EDCs. So I was wondering if the developers could provide any context or reasoning behind the decrease in the number of projects utilizing the brownfield or landfill bid preference from year 2 to year 3 of the NRES program. Give it another moment here. Yeah, I can repeat the question. So the question was about whether developers could provide any context or reasoning behind the decrease in the number of NRES projects utilizing the brownfield or landfill bid preference from year 2 to year 3 of the NRES program.
Mr. Ford.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much. Mr. Arpin, we're not a brownfield, Select Energy is not a brownfield developer to that degree, but I didn't want your question to go completely unanswered. But I think the answer is risk for developers on brownfields, the time and cost associated with developing those projects. That's much different than a simple rooftop system. There are many facets of that project that go into the work with not only from the developer side, but also the local municipality. So I think it's just an overall picture of time, energy, and costs spent to develop that project to get it to the point where a developer says, okay, here's my return on investment. Now I spent all this money over 12 to 18, 24 months to develop it, and now I can finally build it and start seeing revenue from it. So that's a short answer. And again, I wanted to provide some context, but I think that is the answer when you think about the type of project versus a simple rooftop.
I appreciate that response, Mr. Ford. Do any other developers have anything they would want to add to that?
Mr. Hinsky.
Yeah, thank you. Jeff Hinsky, Green Skies Clean Energy. I'll just reiterate that. I mean, we actually have a project right now that is on a landfill, and as we got further into the development process, it was discovered that the cap was not properly maintained, and there is a significant additional cost, which we won't have to bear. Obviously, the landfill owner has to, but it adds significantly to the timeline as well. And so there's just a lot more uncertainty in these landfill projects anyway. Brownfields, there's a whole, you've got lots of environmental reviews that need to be done beforehand and things as well before you can be reasonably assured that you're not going to run into surprises. So there is a level of cost and complexity there that, doesn't mean we don't look at these projects, but they're I guess a smaller subsegment of our overall project portfolio because they are higher risk. You wouldn't want to fill your portfolio with just those type of projects.
Thank you for that response. So moving on, this is another question that I would like to pose to NRES developers. I was wondering whether any NRES developers or participants could provide any context or reasoning behind the lack of enrollment under the solar carport bid preference. As I'm sure that the developer community knows, last year we had increased the carport bid preference to 30%.
Mr. Ford, please.
Thank you again, Mr. Arpin. I think centered around the cost of projects, a carport similar to a brownfield. This is requiring geotech studies. It requires going in front of a planning commission, attorneys being involved, cost of steel. It's a much different project again than a rooftop project. So when you're bidding at a cap of 2699, let's say, for the medium and getting a 30% preference, that would put you right at the medium cap of 18.889 cents. Those projects, if I look at the February solicitation that were selected in the medium, the highest price I think was 184.35. The economics aren't there for a carport at that level for a developer to build that project and make money. It is tight. Similar to, the utilities and the EDCs, their costs go up, labor, insurance, so do ours. There's only so much you can squeeze out of a solar project when labor costs are going up, insurance costs are going up, fees to municipalities are going up, across the board. Inflation has obviously been running wild. So it comes down to cost. And when you're competing at a 30% bid preference, even though it comes in at 1889, the medium cap, the numbers don't lie. It wouldn't work, right? You would have to bid somewhere below the 184.35. That was the highest winner, if I'm correct in what I saw on the February solicitation winners. So considering that, I would just suggest that maybe carports, if we're going to have a true distributed generation solar program in the state, that means solar has to be across the state, across many different areas. And if we're going to include carports, maybe that's a carve out and something that is separate from a rooftop project or a ground mount or a brownfield.
Thank you for that response, Mr. Ford. Any other developers have anything that they would like to add to that?
I think I saw Mr. Verkler come off mute.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. I don't have anything in addition to what he said, but I'd like to reinforce what he said. We have seen where the pricing comes in is on a carport is nowhere near similar to a rooftop or a ground mount project. And when we have people that come to us that want to do a carport and they're in the size category, we just advise them not to. So we don't even proceed in developing with them because they're not going to win a bid. So they're not going to put a lot of effort into developing a product that you can't actually get an NRES award for. So the 30% bid preference is not enough with the price addition of what carports cost. And so we advise them to not proceed.
Thank
So
you.
there are, there are a lot of parking lots around the state to be used, and you don't use the farm fields and the forests, but it's just not economically feasible right now.
Thank you.
We have another hand, Alex Mariquin.
Good morning. So I'm not with the developer, but I'm on the distribution side, right? So we supply a lot of equipment to the smaller CNI guys, and the signaling that we're getting from a lot of the module manufacturers is that costs are going to increase for equipment. So this is just to kind of reinforce what George and Eric just said. The costs are still increasing. It's just going to make it that much harder for these to pencil when we're subject to the price caps. I think it's important to take that into consideration for any program changes that may or may not come in the future.
Thank you. So my final question that I would like to pose to the developer community or any NRES program participants is whether you all could provide any additional insight into why netting projects, at least in Eversource territory, were concentrated in the small zero emission category.
Mr. Hensky.
Yeah, actually, again, Jeff Hinsky from Green Skies Clean Energy. The rec value with the retail rates the way they are and the way the net present value is calculated, many rate classes end up with 0 to negative rec values. So basically, you have to pay the utilities if you want to participate in any kind of net metering program. And of course, logically, that makes no sense. You're locking in a long-term contract that you just have to pay into, and you're betting whether rates are going to continue to rise at the rate they are or not. And so, other than very few specific rate classes, the majority of them just don't make any economic sense.
Thank you for that response. Would any other developers like to add to that? If not, I turn it back to you, Madam Chair, and I thank you for allowing me to ask those questions.
Thank you. And do we have a late addition here, Mr. Trahan?
Hey, good morning, Madam Chair. Good morning, everyone. Mike Trahan with Connecticut Solar and Storage. If it's helpful to the authority, I'm happy to collect some responses to interrogatories on any of the questions that seem better meant for developers for which you didn't get the answers that you're looking for today.
Thank you so much. We will take that under advisement and see if we can direct some written questions to you, Mr. Trahan, and see what we can get back. Appreciate that. Okay, that we are ahead of schedule. That was our complete agenda today. So if folks were waiting to pose questions or comments on the scope of today's technical meeting, please don't be shy, because otherwise our agenda is concluded. Mr. Hartman.
Hello, thank you. I just wanted to add to the response about why there are more netting projects going into the small category as opposed to medium and large. I think it was Jeff who had mentioned. I agree with everything that he said, but I'll just add that, reinforce the point that the retail rates of energy are particularly low, and the way the bidding calculator works, it assumes standard rates, which is not reflective of what those clients are actually experiencing. So because the rec values have a floor of 0 in the small category, can pencil. They can get that full retail value. They're not going into the negative space on the rec bids. Massachusetts has a similar program or floor in their SMART program. They take the retail values. So even on the larger projects, the floor will be 0, and you start to see larger projects that can participate on the netting side. The Connecticut program does not have that. We go into that negative space, and at that point, it might make a little bit more sense to just go to the front of meter and just take the energy and rec as a revenue. So I just wanted to add that little bit of extra color. I think that Jeff said most of it, but hopefully that was helpful.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
I do have an additional point if it's okay.
Sure, Mr. Berkowitz.
Thank you. So there are a number of sites around the state where a front of the meter project might make sense, where their usage might only justify a small project, but it's a large building, so you could do a much larger project and just go buy all. But because the property tax issue still exists, like if the project is sized to load, it's not property taxed. But if it's larger than load, it will receive property tax, and those values will kill the project. Then the product just stays in a small category, and it just stays as behind the meter, a netting product, instead of the appropriate size for the roof space, which would have been a medium or large.
Thank you. Anyone else with questions or comments before we adjourn this morning? All right, if not, we are going to adjourn. We do have another technical meeting in this matter coming up, scheduled for September 5th at 10 a.m. So I ask that you stay tuned to the docket schedule for this proceeding for information about what will be covered at that technical meeting. We thank everyone for their presentations and input today. We'll take that under advisement, and we will see everyone at the next technical meeting. So with that, we will go ahead and adjourn.